Hi everyone, welcome. My name's Ron Suskind. You may know me as a guy who writes books. I've written 6 of them now. These days I am here at Harvard Law School as a lecturer on law, and specifically on a class that I'm teaching this semester called Public Narrative and Justice. A couple of years ago I arrived here as the writer-in-residence of the Shorenstein Center, and then at the Center for Ethics as a senior fellow. And we've been building this idea of public narrative as a project here at Harvard. A public narrative is kind of a vehicle, it's kind of a framing for these giant ecosystems that we live within that shape how we view a whole host, an array of issues. Having fought on the battlefield of public narrative, interviewing presidents, foreign leaders, stakeholders of all varieties over the last 30 years, I've become aware of how public narratives are managed, shaped, sometimes hijacked. How interested parties have gotten better and better at saying this public narrative will be utterly fact-free, but still effective. How's that happen? Or others say, no, the facts are absolutely indisputable here, but the narrative seems to have no currency. Somehow takes no purchase on the landscape. Why that as well? And so part of what we do here is we look at how these narratives get shaped, the mechanisms beneath them, to understand how they are driven in this direction versus that. And specifically, how some of them are driven toward outcomes of justice. Big giant word. A word we like using here at Harvard Law School. So that's why we have our guest today, Catharine MacKinnon, as part of this conversation. Over the last 40 years, Catharine has been at the center, a driving agent, in fact, in the conversations over gender equality. A core theme of our narrative investigations here at Harvard is the issue of equality, racial equality, gender equality, equality of all sorts. In a few weeks we're going to have Evan Wolfson here, who carries forward a 33-year battle to bring marriage equality from the time he was a law student here to the steps of the Supreme Court. For Catharine, she has been at the very center of an evolution across 4 decades as to the rights of women. And so what we're going to talk about today is not just where she has come, the distance traveled, but also what she sees now and what she sees of where we're going. About half an hour from now, 35 minutes, we'll open it up for questions, and we'll be able to do some of that too. We, of course, are in a year of informed consent, and that's why it's especially delicious to have such a key actor on the fault line issues of gender in this year of decision. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Catharine MacKinnon. So let me just open by saying I would like you to do a bit of then versus now. You graduated from Yale Law School in 1977. We have some law students here. You're a young person thinking about your life and how to live a big and meaningful one. You are graduating at a time when the Equal Rights Amendment is kind of wavering a little bit. There was great energy in the late 60s and early 70s as to ERA. State legislatures, like 35 out of 38, I believe, had passed it. But then there was pushback. I think was in her name Phyllis Schlafly?
Schlafly.
There you go, thanks. Schlafly, excuse me, wherever Phyllis is now.
She's in Illinois.
Is she? Yeah. I've lost track, thank you.
She has not lost track.
Yeah, I'm sure she hasn't. And what's interesting about that is that's an issue of how these narratives shift. How sometimes gains create pushbacks that are sometimes ferocious. And at this point as you graduate, you have a big idea as to how gender rights might be applied to the workplace. Give me a sense of you in those shoes as a 20-something-year-old, what you're thinking then, and we'll get to what you've learned since, as to what you might do. And then, of course, this evolves brilliantly to you standing on the steps of the Supreme Court in 1986. What are you thinking then? What do you see that enlivened you as an actor on the public stage? And what did you learn?
Well, there are a couple of questions I have about the narrative structure there, but is this working?
Yeah.
But as to the precise question, the big idea I had resulted from being, not only having been in law school and seeing what, it was just the very beginnings of the idea of equality applied to the question of sex under the Constitution. It had been there statutorily, but constitutionally. So that was 73, 74, 75. I was in law school and I read the original case and some other cases. And what struck me about it was that if this is what they thought inequality was, and their vision of what equality looked like, there was no question about why we didn't have it and how we were never going to get it. And it was figuring out what was wrong with the basic equality model that I began working with. And as I was doing that and seeing that what was wrong with it was that it was about these ideas of sameness and difference. And if you're the same as somebody, you get to be equal to them, but if you're different from them, you don't, which, given the definition of sex as a difference, socially speaking, begins to give you a clue about why we don't have any equality. And this is still their basic model. It comes from Aristotle. Nobody rethought it since, which is a bit of a while. And it also didn't seem to bother anyone that Aristotle was not an American. Now, I am not a xenophobe, but you begin to notice these inconsistencies. And at the same time, I received I was, among other things, making a living and participating in the women's movement and going to graduate school and trying not to pay double tuition. So, if you're actually in graduate school at the same time you're in law school and you're not in a joint degree program because that looks like not enough of either to you, then, that's part of your project. So I was traveling around actually playing music and making money doing this. And I used to do it at women's centers. So I went to a women's center, and at the time I was also writing a dissertation on what I was calling consciousness and social change, namely the relation between what you think about a thing and the way that thing is, which is an old question, but I was applying it to the women's movement. For example, if a woman thinks she can't do something, does that mean she can't do it, or does she think she can't do it because she can't do it? And what's the relation between the barriers that you're up against and your own relation to that, and how does that relate to a whole collectivity of people? In other words, if you see yourself as a woman and you see things happening to other women, what does that do to how you think about yourself? And so on. I was just thinking about all these things. And noticing that there were these things called consciousness-raising groups going on that were actually a methodological way of addressing this exact question, which was an old one in the history of philosophy and political theory, which was my field. So what I would do when I went playing music was sign up at women's centers on their list of sending out their ephemeral materials, as librarians call it. And because this was the source of the information for my thesis. So one day I get this thing from Cornell, and it says, with this woman, Carmita Wood, used to work here, and this is what happened to her. Her boss was just all over her. He's touching her, he's leering at her, he's looking up her skirt, he's after her at the water fountain, he's, while she's doing the filing, etc. And it was incredibly stressful for her, and she really couldn't tolerate it anymore. And she was started to have medical problems as a result of it, so she quit her job. And then she went to file for unemployment insurance, and they told her it was personal, and therefore she couldn't get unemployment. And my head just went, whammo, this is what sex discrimination really looks like. Not this stuff about if you're in one category as opposed to another, can you administer intestate estates? You know, I mean, that's a thing, but that's not, I think, the most grinding problem in the lives of most women, okay? This, and this just goes after all these ideas of women are different from men, et cetera, and called into question the entire sex equality model, but to me it was what sex discrimination looked like. So in this little write-up, it said, anybody have any ideas, write us back. It turned out I was the only one who wrote them back. So I wrote them, and I wrote this thing saying, I think this is what this is, and whatever. Anyway, then wrote a paper in law school, and it became the legal claim for sexual harassment, to make a long story short. But that's what I was thinking about.
I love it. I love it. You know, what's so interesting about that is how active and participatory it can be when you think in those terms. She had I mean, there's eureka moments. That's a whammo moment. Would
it
that
really
be right?
was. Well, it's
so
just,
she has her whammo moment.
You feel like your head is exploding, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and you seem to fit it back together nicely. But, you know,
And
after her head exploded...
Yeah, no, but what it is that sexual violation is at the core of sex discrimination. There are other things that are central to it, too, but that this thing, nobody ever even thought this thought, apparently.
You know, change often occurs when someone has a thought like that. And then the question is, and what will you do about it? And so right as you graduate, you move fairly forcefully into this realm. You know, 79 is your first major legal victory, is that right? Would you say? You're starting to move through the court system up to 86.
Yeah. I'm a big behind-the-scenes person. So I do stuff, I mean, the things we can talk about in general will be maybe 50, 60, 70% of what I do. The rest of it I do entirely behind the scenes, and what it is called in law is confidential. Okay? What this means is you actually are representing people, and you can't go around like blabbing about it in public. And in many cases, you can't ever talk about it in public. So there's
in my world, that's called off the record. But
yeah,
yes,
but that, you know what that means? You talk to the journalists and you trust them.
I hope that's worked out for you.
No, it hasn't.
Yeah, I had that feeling.
Actually,
keep going.
Actually, people that I've talked to as journalists with whom I have had an agreement that something was off the record has worked out. People who have told me this is what my article is going to be about. After I have said, I will, you can write that article if you want, but I will not participate in it because that isn't something I want to be part of. That has not worked out.
Yeah, yeah.
See now the most recent New York Times Magazine article.
Okay, back to it. Let's get right to. Let's go. I want to jump. 1986. You have this seminal moment.
So I'm saying
yeah.
All that was behind the scenes. So you're trying to get years and times, and so what I would just say is that the legal claim for sexual harassment, in some ways in which I was participating, went forward as in the late 70s, and by 79 my book came out.
Right.
But the book was actually talking about things that it had participated in creating, except it never said so, which turns out to be, I recommend it. Right. I recommend it. In other words, do it. Go do it first, okay? Then write about it and go, hey, look at this idea that's out there. Look at what people have done. Here's this decision this judge wrote, right? Quote. Half the time I wrote that quote, okay? Now go reread my work, and it's like, but it's not, how do you say? In law, it's like this kind of thing is not unethical. It's called advocacy. And
I get in trouble for doing that, but
right.
She, as a lawyer, an advocate, can.
Right.
And what's interesting is, in a way, you're shaping your own narrative that then you live within.
Well, I'm not shaping my narrative.
Well,
I'm conveying everything I have done is a result of people coming to me, telling me what happened to them and asking me to do something about it. And this has to have happened to other people, where they've gone to people and said, please do something about something, and they've done it or they haven't. But that is, in many cases, the things people have told me, and this is men as well as women, that involve sexual violation in particular, they hadn't often told anyone. And sometimes they tell me just because they think, this is what it is to actually, how do you just say this sort of thing? To understand your karma in the world. It's like, what is coming to you that tells you who you are? What is your life for? Okay? So when it takes a long time to observe that there's a shape to this in your own life. But because all it is what's happening to you. People are coming to you and they say, sometimes they come to me and they tell me these things just because they think it will matter if I know it. Well, you got to be accountable for being the person. Who is that person to other people? What are you going to do about that then? And so, each thing that I've done, the sexual harassment work, the pornography work, the rape as genocide work, Violence Against Women Act work, which is mainly hugely behind the scenes, but is on that list, and other issues, sexual harassment in education and employment, actually, and are a result of that. Just people coming, women and men, coming and saying, and I was going to say, as to narrative, this is a kind of a fancy word for this thing that to me goes, and then he, and then he, and then he. That's what it is. And so then here she is, here he is, and what can we do? What can we do together? So you become like a medium.
Yeah. I love the idea of a medium. I think that feels
It's
just
called
right.
representation.
You're a vessel for all of their grievance and for all of their dreams.
It comes through you, and you are accountable to them. That is my understanding of representing a client, or representing a person or a movement, and it's always with their permission and always check back with them each and every step of the way. The other thing I've learned about, among the many things, is when people first come to me, often they've been through other lawyers and or they still are, and they want me to intervene with their lawyer for them. Things like that. There's so many fronts of advocacy, and what it is that the people aren't really listening. And so there's the shape of the representation of their injury, which you really have to understand people identify with in a very specific way. If you have any doubt about this, go listen to how people talk about the Holocaust and consider what people's response is to how that is discussed. Okay? Or look at how people debate the question of whether data that was gathered on medical experiments during the Holocaust will be part of the medical record. If you have any doubt about how people identify with the products of their injury and their existence in the world as the world goes forward, it's like, that's mine. You don't lie about that. No, you don't distort that fact. You don't move that fact just over a little bit. Or you can't use those so-called facts because they were taken from me in the following ways. Okay, so, this is narrative alive in the world.
Yeah.
Okay? And so what I find is that lawyers very often turn people's violations into these things they call facts. They write up affidavits and so on, but they are a misprision, a misrepresentation of their experience. And what it is they're trying to make it fit into a pre-existing legal narrative, is part of it. But part of it is just that they're really imprecise. They aren't really listening. Okay? So the first thing I do is I redo the whole story because the story is wrong. And that turns out to be, first of all, I redo it in ordinary language, which turns out to be one of the most radical things I've ever done. You know, and you just remake it so it actually speaks her voice.
Yeah.
And again, you know, if you do that, it isn't called an appropriation of her voice. You know, it's called giving it a megaphone, you know, putting it out there, making it possible for it to be heard, if this is what she says she wants, right? But what then happens is pretty soon you're making legal change because very little of the legal system has been pre-constructed to hear that voice, to recognize those injuries in that form.
Yep.
You know, and so that's how this is all taken place.
Yep.
But it all starts right there. You know, it starts with her or him. People call it coming forward. Not sure quite, you know, they weren't back before. You know, they were like trying, you know, and working with this. But you know, that's really the ground of this.
Yeah, it's lovely. You know, one of the things interesting is you're bringing heartbeat. You write sometimes not like a lawyer, and I think that's an advantage. I don't consider legal writing myself. But, you know,
legal writing is to writing as military music is to music, if you want to.
Oh, I'm stealing that. That's terrific. What chops she's got.
Don't tempt me.
No, I'm here to tempt you. You know, so now what you're talking about is you moving forward and being a vessel for the heartbeat and the pain of so many people. But an enormous occurrence, an aid, an assist comes. Even after 86, when you're granted cert, when you get your ruling, when we arrive at 1991 with Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. Now, I have to say, in the class the other day when I mentioned the Anita Hill Clarence Thomas hearings, I said, how many people know what that is?
Like television's turned off all over the room. You know,
and I was stunned. And everyone, remember? Young people? Some? Oh, boy. So in 1991, before some of you were born, or around that time...
but that was a bunch of them.
There was a big event. And it was an event that was a cultural event, an event that shaped people. And in some ways, it gave heartbeat. It gave a face. And it gave us...
a beautiful face.
Anita Hill.
Yeah.
And also a status, which I thought was interesting, of this woman sitting in front of that brutal camera and microphone.
Ugly, hairy microphone shoved in her face.
Right. Now, so Clarence Thomas, who was an official EEOC who was chosen by George H.W. Bush, then the president, to be the next, his nominee for the Supreme Court, arrives at his advise and consent moment, and around it arrives an explosion. If you want to read about this, I recommend a book called Strange Justice by actually two buddies of mine, Jill Abramson, former editor of the New York Times, and Jay Mayer, who just handle it brilliantly. And at this moment, we had an episode of cultural collision and frisson. Anita Hill was there next to Clarence Thomas and saying, this is what it felt like to be harassed by this man, day after day, working under him, and being essentially a target of his unwanted entreaties. Thomas attempted to defend himself. He called in the race card, called then and now the same, and said this is nothing but a high-tech lynching. Hill was unbowed, though, all the way through. And I think that was something that echoed forward powerfully through the culture. It's like, no. He can say whatever he wants. I was there, and this is what happened. And if you want to know what it feels like, listen to my voice. Thomas is confirmed as a justice, as we now know, but Hill emerges unbowed. And I'll tell you, it was nasty. For those of you who weren't around or not sentient in those years, the line from the Republican right was, she's a little nutty and she's a little slutty. And that was everywhere. And still, Anita Hill did not emerge as a victim. And that was crucial. Didn't harassment cases rise after that? How did that feel for you when that moment occurred? Where were you, by the way, when this happens?
I was on television with Tom Brokaw the whole time.
That's great.
And I was watching the hearings on live feed.
Really?
Inside that studio.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So I saw like absolutely every minute of it, and whenever they went to the bathroom in Washington, we had a chance to go to the bathroom. That was how that was. And then we were always talking, and then we get something where he would like the conversation, and so then you go, okay, let's put that on, and then they'd take a quick break from the testimony, record it down, and then we would talk about it on air.
How did it feel for you?
It was like a national consciousness-raising session.
Wow.
Everybody was thinking about it, and everyone was watching this beautiful woman with her absolutely unshakable dignity just be profoundly present there, and at the same time, talk about feeling profoundly violated. Yeah. It was remarkable, and what I felt was women identifying with her all over the country. Yeah. And that happened, and you're right that complaints went up dramatically of sexual harassment after that. And it's interesting that, and I think this is a real takeaway point here, that, as you mentioned, Clarence Thomas was confirmed, and she wasn't saying, he should or shouldn't be confirmed. She just thought, since they had asked her, did she know anything about him that was relevant to this process? And she had then responded and told them that people should know this. And you can say she lost, and from the standpoint of, if you were trying this as a case, which it wasn't, you would say she lost, but actually it seems she didn't in a certain major way, because what happened was women identified with her to the degree that they thought, first of all, what's happened to me is at least as egregious as what she's saying he did to her. And if that is going to be given an actual hearing, maybe I can do something about what's happened to me. But even more than that, women felt, I'm with her. It's like the identification was really profound with her, and it wasn't only with her narrative by any means. It was with her as a person, with her presence, with her being, with her, I guess you say in law, demeanor, and her credibility. Women felt like if she could do it, they could do it. If she could take it, they could take it. And they wanted to be with her. And there's just this massive spike in the EEOC complaints after that. What's happened since is we had another narrative, the Bill Clinton narrative, and it wasn't the Monica Lewinsky situation, it was Paula Jones. And
the irony is Clinton gets elected right in the wake of...
Clinton gets elected in large part because women are... He's campaigning on the Violence Against Women Act, and people are enraged with the way Anita Hill was treated. And he, according to political science, he was elected largely because of this. And, so then there's this certain live by the sword, die by the sword logic, where he's, then accused of sexual harassment by Paula Jones in an account that he eventually admitted to having done. And what the courts, it was so interesting because with Anita Hill, it wasn't in court, and nobody said it was sexual harassment exactly. At the time that it happened, would be really right very much on the far edge of being not likely to have been considered to have been sexual harassment by the courts in the D.C. Circuit at the time, although it could have been. So it was very dicey. By the time she said it, by the time she brought it out, maybe. It has to do with, is it severe enough? Was it pervasive enough? I would say probably pervasive enough. Unclear if it was severe enough because it didn't take physical forms. This is a bunch of things the courts have done with the standards, right? So it wasn't ever said that it was or wasn't sexual harassment. But then along comes Clinton and Paula Jones, and in which she alleges that he exposed himself to her, told her to engage with it, et cetera, meantime having locked the door, and then he's meantime feeling her all over and stuff, and then she says she's not that kind of girl, and so on. He says then, I don't want you to do something you don't want to do, and puts it back in, and then says, I know you're smart, you're a smart girl, we won't talk about this. So the question is that sufficiently severe to be considered hostile environment sexual harassment? It was a single incident. He's the highest employer in the state. She's a secretary. After this, she complains. She doesn't do much for a while. Then she complains eventually. But her job keeps sinking. Pretty soon she's transferred to an office with no window and given no work, things like that. But those things just sort of faded out of the case. What it ended up being ruled on was, is it sexual harassment, hostile environment, sufficiently severe, what it is he did? And the court said no. And the complaints tanked. In other words, what we had was
tanked. That's fascinating.
A real break in the real rules between women and men with Anita Hill. And it isn't that he was kept off the court. What it is does it mean that the more power you have, the more you can do to a woman, and the less will ever be done about it? Just that main rule. No one will ever hear about it. No one will ever care. People cared. They cared, okay? Whatever happened, they cared about what happened to Anita Hill. And nobody ever wants to go through what Clarence Thomas went through. Okay, that's called, you care not to have this go down, all right? Along comes Bill Clinton. He does this, it goes on, and guess what? The more power you have, the more you can do anything to a woman, and nothing will be done about it. And nobody cares. Nobody cares. It's like all the liberals are saying, oh, this is just a right-wing conspiracy. Suddenly, if the right wants to get real interested in a woman being sexually violated, fine. I want to know, where are the liberals? Okay, the liberals want to know, why is only the right wing that's interested in this? Okay, I want to know who gives a damn about Paula Jones. They say, well, they don't give a damn about Paula Jones. They're just trying to use this politically. Well, they may be, but I give a damn about Paula Jones. Okay, so anyway, what happened is the reinstitution of the real rule, and so, when you had broken it, women had hope. Men too. They felt like, the fact that he has so much more power than I do, generally it's men who sexually harass women, although sometimes women sexually harass men. Generally they don't, but, the numbers are very small. But they sometimes do. Overwhelmingly it's men in the 90 above 6, 7, 8 percentile, so far as is known. And so I use the term statistically, can get away with it. The more power he has, the more likely he can do anything sexually he wants, and nothing will ever happen. And that was broken by Anita Hill, and it was reinstituted by Bill Clinton.
Yeah, I have a question. Now, you're a prominent person, and you must mix in some circles. Have you ever talked to Bill Clinton about this? In any fashion?
Man, give me 2 hours in a room alone with this man.
Okay.
He will never emerge the same.
Okay, okay. Okay, look. Okay, let's try it. Okay, so let's do a little fantasy camp here. I'm Clinton.
Okay, you know what?
You.
My fantasy, my real fantasy is this man makes his legacy from here forward, the creation of truth and reconciliation commissions for men who have violated women, which he will begin by exemplifying by renting a stadium for all the women he's ever sexually violated, and talk about it in detail if he can remember. And then they will see if they want to, once he's done truth, they can see if they will reconcile.
Well,
okay? And every bend in the road, I want to see one of these things.
Okay. I'll just wish you direct your questions directly to me while we do this conversation.
No, really, this...
No, I mean, literally, what would you say to him if he's sitting right here and he's saying, Catherine, I'm a flawed man. I've made my mistakes. I'm not a criminal.
Right.
That's what he says.
Yeah. What I would want to talk to him about is that it's not about morality, and it's not about religion, and it isn't about something that therapy will address. Let's you and me talk politics.
I'm happy to.
Okay.
Let it go.
And, so at that point, I mean, first of all, it's like I need the real guy.
Well,
okay.
Look, it's the best I can do.
You're doing well.
Yeah.
You're doing well, and we also need not an audience, because it's not.
Would ever just walk out that door?
No,
There's pizza downstairs.
It's not public discourse. It is not entertainment. It is for real.
Yeah. Well, that's why I asked. I said, that's kind of you sitting with
where we start.
You sitting with Bill Clinton is something that I think there would be a significant consensus of public purpose to say that's a sit down I want. I mean, you talking to Bill Clinton, he is the actor of consequence still on the
you know
public
where
stage.
I want to start with him?
Yeah.
Okay, my first thing I want to do with him is to say, we want to talk about these specific women.
Yeah.
But I want to begin with Hillary.
Yep.
Okay. And
let's.
Yeah. And on my observation, you lied to her to start out with about what you did. And you made her lie in public. You knew it was a lie. She didn't.
Now, I'm not sure about that, if she didn't know it was a lie.
No, but if you lied to her and she believed you,
well, that's a
you
question.
made her lie for you in public.
Clinton would say that's a question between me and my wife.
Okay.
And I'll tell you, there's a lot of things. Look, people lie about sex, and you know it, and I know it. And there are things that she knew that she might not have admitted to, and things that she probably knew that she didn't want to say in public.
Okay.
And that's private in our family and in our life.
Okay. And what I want to say is that there's one analysis of sexism that's, you understand some things about. There's another analysis of misogyny. Mm-hmm. And what you're defending is something you did that is misogynistic.
Yeah, sure.
Which is you made her lie for you in public.
Yeah.
And, until you rectify that, I don't forgive you.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So that's where I start.
Wow. That's something, isn't it? If only we could have conversations like that in this society.
3 hours maybe, okay?
3 hours. And but it comes to this.
He talks a lot.
But it comes.
That's what I get paid for.
One of the things that's interesting is you think about how some of this is baked into even now Hillary Clinton's public profile, because this is part of the Hillary Clinton story.
I know it.
And and I think that it's fair to say that people succeed in public life when they can manage to evolve in public, to show authenticity, to say, look, here's who I am, and here is you knowing me, so you can make a decision as to whether I should represent you. And I think one of the difficulties she has is the complexity of her current profile, and maybe her inability to get at some of these unasked or certainly unanswered questions of her life. I mean, does that go to one of the issues that you see in all the polls? How many young women are not supporting Hillary as might have been expected, especially among Democratic women? Because, the older women, yes, but the younger women, look, the numbers are dismal for Hillary. Maybe they've grown up in a time where they say, no, you need to be straight with us about everything. And I'm not going to abide by these, things not said when the stakes are so high.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still going on the assumption that she believed him. I also know her some, and, she actually loves him. Okay, so there's that.
Yep.
It's not an excuse, but it's a description of something. I think that, Hillary's way of being both sort of, she has an interesting sort of hide and flash dynamic, a carefulness, mm-hmm. but also a real ability to be open.
Yeah.
And I just think that in addition to her, she understands sexism, as I was making that distinction. I think she less well, if at all, understands misogyny, especially its sexual roots.
Yeah.
And where she was in the women's movement when that kind of awareness was most prominent and so on is, she was working mainly on racism and other issues. So I think it's a different thing.
Not understanding misogyny is a material issue as mm-hmm. arguably or possibly the first woman president. That matters.
Well, yes, it matters. I think she's capable of understanding it.
She just needs a MacKinnon session.
Well, what I think is that her, and this is what I've noticed about a lot of the people around Bill Clinton, is that their experience of sexual abuse, being called out in public, is an experience, they recoil from that.
Yeah.
And they do because of the ways that it's been used against them.
Yeah, right.
So that in spite of the fact that Bill Clinton, sponsored the Violence Against Women Act and was, strong in it and so on, and doesn't seem to have understood some of at least what he even said he did as being covered by the civil remedy that, actually the last time I was in this room, I debated with Charles Freed the striking down of that remedy. Mm-hmm. But I just think that, for example, Rahm Emanuel is a good example of this, and I've had a fairly extensive engagement with him on this subject. Basically, they think of sexual violation as a sort of third-order issue. And it may be that some young women have had a life experience that allows them to think of it that way too, in which case that's a real victory for us, boy, in certain ways, because we know that a good half or more have been sexually violated, but may or may not think of that as a major issue for themselves. But the experience of the people close to the Clintons is that this is a got-up pretext for going after somebody for some other reason.
Right.
And historically, there's real basis for this. For example, being used by white supremacists against young men of color. And they think of it as, so then it's being thought of as only something that really wasn't so bad, and it's only an excuse for going after somebody for some other reason, that somebody with power is trying to use it to get at somebody else, as opposed to somebody who is comparatively less powerful having a real, actual injury about which something should be done. So it's that structure that just seems to have been largely missed.
Well, I'll get to questions in a second, but I think what's so important is how you, in the many decades since, have fought against those power imbalances and those larger structures. Certainly, all of your efforts in terms of pornography, in terms of violence against women, are to alter a landscape in which these things occur in a fundamental way. And right now, here at Harvard and at many universities, we are deep into the issues of consent and sexual violence. And I know people in the room are interested in talking to someone of Catharine's consequential position on that. But you know, what you see in that debate are some things said and other things not, as to the broad fabric, the landscape in which people arrive at college in America in the early part of the 21st century.
Well,
and how do we deal with it? And how do we deal with that
I mean, if
in
we're
a
going
way
to have
that's
questions,
meaningful?
we're going to have to do it soon.
Let's have some questions now.
Yeah, if you want to raise having raised the consent thing, I would just say that the landscape that's missed, it seems to me, largely in that discussion is the landscape of sex inequality. And it's certainly the case that requiring the saying of yes or else no is the answer is a big improvement to no meaning yes, which is roughly the comparison of where we stand. There's no doubt about that. But there's a lot of not yes saying going on out there too, conceitedly, as well as sex that people have that they want to have. But in general, I just would like to point out that under circumstances of sex inequality, there's no magic in terms of welcomeness or wantedness or desire to the saying of yes. Often it's acquiescence. It's, oh, well, okay, let's get it over with. And one may think somebody shouldn't go to prison for, oh, well, okay, let's get it over with. But at the same time, it's not equal. So it's a question of what your standard is. If you have a standard of equality in sexual interactions, it seems to me that consent is a pathetic and piss-poor substitute for that equality. Because what it tends to mean is resignation. It means despair. It means defeat. It means I give up. I'm just saying it's not an equality standard, that's all. It is an improvement over its absence. But to act like that's something we should run up a flag and salute, I think shows low standards.
If folks have questions, they can go to the mic. I know lots of the young folks have said they want it. How about you in the back?
My name is Kanchi Gandhi. I am in the biology department.
Yeah.
Regarding Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, was not Justice Clarence Thomas confirmed with the support of a few Democratic senators?
No doubt. Yeah.
So that's what I was surprised, that the because of the Democratic support.
Yeah, but so what? I mean, I'm talking about male supremacy doesn't distinguish between Republicans and Democrats.
So now, my way of thinking was that it's not just all the people in one party being on one philosophy and the other party. It's not.
That's correct. And for that reason, I haven't been distinguishing between Republicans and Democrats.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jay Gallagher, I'm wondering whether you're concerned about the lies that he used to make false accusations about sexual misconduct, such as we saw at the University of Virginia at the frat house, which was widely splashed all over a cheap tabloid like Rolling Stone, and people rushed to judgment, or about the Duke lacrosse team in which 3 young men were falsely accused and their civil rights violated, and many other less high-profile cases in which we create this kind of cult of victimhood in which people are encouraged to feel that they're victims to the point of making up stories and getting not only a public lynching such as Clarence Thomas did, but a kind of sense that someone would have to defend themselves against false accusations rather than the person who's making those accusations provides substantiation for them. I mean, we're seeing something where you don't get penalized for making these type of lies.
I'm sorry, I missed that last phrase. You don't get what?
There's very little penalty for making lies.
very
You
little
can make
penalty.
false accusations and you don't get a sentence. Maybe you get a small fine or something, which makes it very easy to do this and rewards you in various ways, both with the publicity as well as perpetuating this sense that it's very easy to do and that you are drawn into this kind of whole victimhood cult.
Yep.
Yeah. There's always a concern that anyone about anything can make an accusation that isn't true. The studies that have been done of this show that between 2 and 5% of allegations of sexual assault are not true. And that's about the same as allegations of other things. If you do it in court, it's perjury. It could be, or it could just be that one loses. But I would also just suggest, first of all, as to the Duke lacrosse example and other examples, there is, I wouldn't just assume that everything you've read about the making and then the debunking of the making of the claim is all there is to the story. Often there is much more there. If not always in exactly the form in which it was originally made. And the other thing I would point out is that the notion that women, particularly, or men, and this you see young boys raising claims about being sexually abused in the Catholic Church cases, you see it in young Native people in Canada and the United States raising these claims about residential schools and having been sexually assaulted for decades. You see it in the Magdalen Laundry cases in Ireland. And there is usually very little to be gained in raising these claims and a great deal of abuse to sustain. As a matter of fact, most people that I know who actually care about people who have been sexually abused, including who have been violated in schools these days, tell them not to complain, is the truth of the matter. And I'm really sorry to be saying that. But it is true. And the reason is because of what they will go through if they do. And it's always very carefully considered. It's an abusive process, actually. What's amazing if you read about how people write about it as well as listen to them is often they will say, the rape was nothing to the way I was treated afterwards. Think about that. So, it really is actually quite the reverse. One doesn't, nobody wants to be a famous victim. That is to be known, to have your name be known as having been sexually violated. And, it takes a tremendous amount of commitment, usually to other women, is what I know from having worked with people in these situations all these years. The idea that he would ever do this again to some other woman is it's just beyond them. They just cannot imagine sitting there and letting this be the case, that each day will go by and they will not know. But what he would do this to some other woman, and they could maybe have stopped it. They maybe could have done something about it. If they had come forward, something might have prevented him from doing it again. And they just can't live with themselves that way. And, what they get put through is unspeakable in a good many cases.
We have a question here. Why don't you stand up and speak? Yeah, just be loud.
Sure, my name's Wendy. And I'm wondering if you believe that there's a connection between sort of this, there used to be a definition of race that people have moved on to understand. And it's gotten, it's sort of, there's sort of an attempt to redefine race consistently. And there's also, from what I can understand, there seems to be a connection maybe with the lack of sex education that's going on in schools. And I'm wondering if you there's a connection.
Yeah, I think so. In that,
Could you just restate a question?
restating the question, is there a connection? Well, that she began by saying that there used to be a definition of rape that everyone agreed on, and that that has now become more broad? And is there a connection between that and the lack of sex education that is being done in high schools? And, you know, I think yes, in that numbers of people are trying to figure out how to do sex education in a way that would promote equality in sexual interactions, so that what people actually want to convey, communicate, the intimacies that they desire to have, and what they want to express to each other, you know, through their bodies, through a sexual exchange, is respectful and mutual and real between them. So people are trying to figure out how to, you know, people work with this all the time in their lives and their relationships, but people are trying to figure out how to teach something like that in high schools, and there are a lot of barriers to, you know, in local educational environments to being able to go forward with the doing of that. But that same idea, which used to be called sexual liberation, actually, is part of the surrounding narrative of what has brought a lot of pressure, at least, on the rape law, I think for the better in many respects. But, I mean, the older definition of rape that you're talking about was, I think, clear at the expense of excluding a lot of experiences of really forcible sexual violation that were never recognized. And women just, in general, don't report it. I mean, sexual abuse is massively underreported. I mean, the studies of underreporting show it's about 10 to 1 of those acts which actually fit the existing legal definitions of rape and those that are actually reported. So, yeah, I mean, I think there is a connection there in that the same desires and pressures are operating on the legal system as are operating in the social system. And, you know, with mixed results, I would say, in both areas.
Yeah, and it's part of the thing that we study is changes in norms and how they drive legal outcomes or not, and how these work side by side, as well as how individual narratives drive social change. We have 3 more questions, and why don't we just do here, and then that'll finish it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, how aware are you of how astonished a law enforcement official is, a patrolman, for example, if someone were to say to them, the reason that I'm talking to you is not that I want you to do something about what happened to me, but because I don't want it to happen to someone else.
What do you mean, how astonished they would be?
Oh, you know, that's something they don't usually hear.
Well, I don't know how you know that.
Well, having been the victim of a crime, that's how I...
No, I mean,
and
but
you
you're
say
talking...
you say to a patrolman, a police officer, look, I'm not talking to you because I want you to catch this guy that pulled a knife on me in the park here. I'm saying it because I don't want that to happen to someone else.
Well, I don't know how astonished they would be about it, but the other thing is... No, but the other thing is
they're really shocked by that.
No, but there's something kind of twisted up in the middle of that, which is, if you don't want it to happen to someone else, you do have to have the police officer do something about the fact the guy pulled a knife on someone else.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is that...
I don't want you to do something about it, but I do because it may stop them from doing it to somebody else.
Right, but generally the police, law enforcement are very surprised to hear that. It actually, like, it's a shocking thing for them.
I don't know how you can say generally, but maybe they are.
Yeah.
It's not about me, it's about some other person, is your point. And you find that provocative.
So you find that something, yeah.
I mean, it was amazing that when that happened to me about 10 years ago, that they were quite astonished that I would be concerned about this person running around. They don't usually hear that, obviously, because they were just, you know.
But did you tell them, I don't want you to corral this person because...
Oh, no, I want you to
Okay, well, that's what you said. Sorry.
Yeah, I want you to protect the general populace from this individual who was intoxicated and pulled a knife on me, and they were astonished that I said that.
I see.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
That is interesting.
Yeah,
it is. It also raises the issue of training of police, which they could apparently use. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hello.
Can you pull up a little closer to the mic?
Sorry, I'm short. So in talking about originally thinking through sexual harassment as a claim, you described this process of listening to women talk about their experiences and realizing that their current attempts to try and get legal remedies actually sort of did a disservice to the actual experience and sort of distorted it into something that
Originally, there was no legal claim at all.
Right.
Okay, now there is a legal claim, and the legal claim partially grasps it, but also does a disservice to it in the way you said. Yeah. So that's an overtime move. Yeah.
So my question really is that it seems to require a level of creative thinking outside of the box of currently existing legal frameworks and legal narratives that I think that, especially as, giving this talk at a law school is kind of scary for people to sort of think outside the box when we're often taught to think according to certain rules and according to certain lines. And so I guess what advice would you give to especially young legal thinkers who might see various harms in the world that the legal system doesn't currently have the correct or an accurate way of thinking about and addressing, who are sort of trying to get at what that process of sort of change and reinventing what remedies need to exist in the world to harms that are currently unaddressed?
So this is for you to talk about don't lose your narrative.
Right. I think one of your points is that much of our actions and judgments come from this wider landscape of assumptions that grow out of these narratives that we often don't examine in sunlight. And one of the things that is so provocative about Catharine is that she never lost her narrative, if I can throw it back to her, throughout a long set of decade-long struggles. And what I find with many public actors is they sometimes do lose their narrative. They forget about the wider ecosystem in which the actions you mention are occurring. They look at it too specifically, maybe too narrowly, as to action and outcome, rather than the things that drive action. And one of the key points of understanding the times in which we live, and not only the distance traveled to this point, but where we're going, in a long longitudinal journey on issues of equality, which are not at points of finish almost ever on all the great issues of race or gender, is how that time present affects what you do and what you think.
Yeah, I just want to say, power will push you only in one direction. And, power comes at you from the front of a classroom. It comes at you from your peers around you. It comes at you from, what happens when you go for job interviews or when you think about, getting yourself hired at this or that or the other place. And it has all to do with making you, smaller, narrower, like narrower this way as well as smaller this way. And not... there's something really paradoxical with the way law school works, which is it starts out by looking for this broad diversity of wonderful people with all these incredible experiences who, have this extraordinary, depth of understanding of their own communities and, just bring this richness to this place. And what happens in law schools, not because anyone wants it to, but it does, is that, they get shaped by power. And you can talk to the students as, you can regard the students as sort of caving into it, but actually it's more like, being fish swimming in water. And I'm talking about the water. And it's this thing that, is appearing to give you sustenance and that seems to be buoying you along. And, but it's actually only a river going in one direction. And, almost you don't notice the flow and the tide and the speed and the trajectory and the fact it only goes that place, And so the going upstream, the going out of the stream, it's like, what is that scary stuff out there called air? Can we live on that? Just those whole sets of questions. It's just a matter of, to me, when I went to law school, it was like, I can't believe these people actually, the stuff I would read and the things I would hear them say, it would be like, I can't believe they think I'm going to agree with this. I can't believe this. They're writing this as if by the time I'm done reading this, I think they're right. No, I just think now I know more about the way they see this. It's, what do we call this, critical distance a little bit here? Mm-hmm. And, keeping that, remembering where you come from, and sort of staying accountable to why people don't believe their own experiences as much as they believe the narrative's power tells them about their experiences. That is a really serious question. And, it's something that actually the women's movement really made a move in. And it said, believe your own experience. Yeah. Everybody's got a story, okay? So you can't just go, oh, that's a narrative. There must be truth in there. It's the structural circumstances of, people who in society have been relegated to a position of lesser power. Those are the experiences that we are told don't have a story, aren't true, can't have a narrative, may not be spoken. This is what Hollywood will tell you. I work with these people, and so I can tell you. They will tell you nobody would watch a film made like that, okay, in which what actually happened to, say, Linda Borman, who was coerced into the film Deep Throat and to make other pornography. The way that actually went down, nobody will watch that movie. Nobody can see it. What does that mean? That means they have a notion of the structure of the tropes that make up the narrative that power will approve. Now, who is nobody in that phrase? It assumes that all the women who have been sexually violated, we're talking, around about half the population of women. Now that's a large movie audience, would you not say? Will not believe it. People, they've got this idea somewhere, they call themselves the creative community, that people want to see their own lives presented on screen as entertainment. That's some idea that they have. And then they sort of work to expand the notion of whose own lives are the people who are going to be represented on the screen up there, and hence this whole dialogue about it. But I just want to point out that they begin to get a little closer to hints at the realities, but what they have yet to do. In other words, how to put this? There is a conventional narrative that is both created and reproduced by the consciousness machine, which is, the media, Hollywood, now social media to some extent, although social media is, has the capacity to blow holes in it. And then there's the counter-narrative to the conventional narrative. And the conventional narrative is, she's nutty, she's slutty, she lies, she wants it, she's a whore, first of all, you can't both lie about sex and be a whore, because if you're a whore, you actually had it. And if you lied about it, you didn't actually have it. But logic is not their strong point. Okay? So, both of those are like out there at the same time. And if you put out an entirely different narrative, as to which, beginning with sexual abuse in childhood is where most of it starts, and you go on, but although not always, and then you go on from there. Or, you get abducted from someplace, gang raped first, then have the lives of your family threatened, and then watched in the bathroom and slept on top of, and then had your phone calls listened in on, and then a gun put to your head and made pornography, as to which the gun is off screen. That is the story they say nobody can see, so we have to make it into a different story. So I just say that to both embrace and push back a little bit on the creativity part, because sometimes the creativity is just looking at what is really there as against the conventional narrative.
Right. You've become a narrative expert in 1 hour. Extraordinary. Last question, and then we'll finish up. Hi, what's your name?
Hi, my name is Nita.
Hi, Nisha.
Hi. So my question is about the intersectionality analysis of feminism these days, and the fact that a lot of intersectional feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw or Adele Morrison have openly spoken about the fact that we need to repeal mandatory pro-West policies for domestic violence and sexual assault within communities of colour, because it's not leading to women in these communities actually reporting these instances of violence. My question is, how do you respond to those particular calls?
Yeah, Kim Crenshaw actually created the analysis called intersectionality. Yeah. And I just, need to make, she is the one who theorized that. And there are lots of people now practicing it, and but she is its primary exponent and practitioner. Actually, mandatory reporting has all sorts of issues and sidedness to it. And it is, the difficulties are accentuated in communities that are subordinated as communities, which will be communities of color in the West. But there are a lot of reasons why women don't report cases of domestic violence. High on that list are they think they will not be believed, or they think that the institutions will treat the people they are complaining about worse than they should be, or that something drastic will happen to their family. In other words, they will lose the means of existence or whatever. And I put it this way in order to show that there's an exaggerated effect that has on communities of color, but it isn't confined to them. And there are real experts on domestic violence in this room, Diane Rosenfeld primarily among them. But what I would just say is that the other aspect of mandatory reporting is sometimes police officers will mandatorily report victims for attempting to defend themselves, and that then gets seen as, as an act of aggression, et cetera. So if it's mandatory charging after that, then that's what that means. I put it this way because issues that affect women of color squared. And that they are of color is crucial. That they are women is not to be forgotten. And that whatever is true for them is going to be true for women of all groups in some respect, so long as it is happening to them as women of color. So I was just sort of drawing out some of the dimensions of that, which is what Kimberly Crenshaw does so well in her work. And what I would just say is that I think, have come to think that, first of all, just that the tool of evidence-based prosecution is maybe something better than the way that structure you've described works. In other words, what you do is, if someone reports, that's their decision, first of all. So that means something needs to be done. Sometimes, by the way, what I've noticed with sexual abuse, and this is astounding, is that women and men, men who had sex with men, women who had sex with men, usually, those groups of people, just will sometimes report being violently sexually abused, not by the man they had sex with, not because they didn't want to have sex with him, but because they didn't want him to violently sexually abuse them the way he did. And also, and then with subordinated communities in particular, such as gay men, all sorts of crazy stuff happens when you try to report a thing like that. I mean, that somebody would report a man that he wanted to have sex with because the man was violent to him, and he wanted him not to be violent ever to anyone else again. I mean, all this stuff is in my casebook, by the way. Footnotes, see them all. And testimony, all by people, it's all in there. Is this amazing view of the legal system, which it seems to me it ought to be living up to, but isn't for the most part. So then they hesitate to bring anything at all, including when they're actually violently raped and didn't want to have sex with that man, including men. So you have that problem. But anyway, evidence-based prosecution is somebody does decide they want to make a report, and then the legal system goes quickly to gather all the evidence it can right away, right then, pictures, tests, testimony, signed, the whole thing like now. And then whatever she later decides is out of the hands of the legal system. In other words, the legal system can then proceed against him if it decides to, but it also then means that anything he tries to do to her further to get her to withdraw the report is ineffectual because they've already got the evidence. And it ends up meaning that batterers, who are very often extremely manipulative, don't have the kind of power over those women anymore that they did initially. But it does rely on her being the initial reporter. So that's just one way to talk about the areas that you raise.
Thank you very much. We finish these sessions often by asking a question that has come up, something John Lewis and I talked about. John Lewis, of course, has a moment of his individual story where he is struck on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. 70 million people are watching on CBS. This drives change because they saw it and they had to make a decision as to their own lives. Which character am I going to live within? The guy in the horse with the club, or the young student with his backpack? An individual story. And we've talked a lot about individual stories and their power. I know this to be true. I lived it. Lewis is asked what others are asked. What does the promised land look like in these struggles? These long struggles that we are within right now, at a point in. What does the promised land look like to you as you look forward on these issues of gender equality that you spent your whole life battling?
Well, I think it looks like we don't elect Nazis to the presidency.
I think on that note...
no, I have something more to say about it.
Let her rip.
They have stories too, and it means, the ERA is actually gaining steam and strength,
yep.
And there's a new draft of it, which is also in my casebook.
Bernie Sanders has it in his policy papers.
Does he have our new draft in it?
I'll check when we get
so.
back to the office. I bet he does.
Anyway, Carolyn Maloney has a new version of it, which contains the old version, so it's got gender neutral, applies to everybody. Sex, will not, on account of sex, your rights are not affected, etc. But it has a new first sentence. Women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and in all places subject to its jurisdiction. It's called Say What You Mean. And, now it's up to us to mean what we say here. And so I think that's part of it. Having been left out of a constituting document is not something that goes away when you get old. It gets worse as you go along, like a snowball rolling down a mountain. It gets bigger and heavier and wetter and more dangerous. And so, that I wouldn't say is exactly the promised land, but it holds a lot of potential.
The arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice. King says, I think it bends because of days like this where we all think and reach and pull on it with all of our might. Thank you, Catharine MacKinnon.
Well, thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
You're wonderful.
This was great.